the Axeman of New Orleans, when jazz was a matter of life and death.
The last days of innocence. In the spring of 1918, New Orleans was a city alive with possibility. The waves of Italian immigrants who had arrived in previous decades had woven themselves into the fabric of the city, their grocery stores and shops becoming cornerstones of neighborhood life. Along quiet streets lined with crepe myrtles and magnolias, these family-owned establishments served as gathering places where neighbors exchanged gossip over fresh produce and warm bread. Just weeks earlier, the city had buzzed with excitement when Charlie Chaplin himself appeared at the Strand Theatre for a screening of his latest film. The war in Europe was winding down, and despite the headlines from overseas, there was a sense that better days lay ahead. In the evenings, the sweet sounds of jazz drifted from clubs and dance halls, mixing with the humid air and the clatter of streetcars. The Italian grocers had carved out their own piece of the American dream. They lived above or behind their stores in modest apartments, working long hours but building something for their children. They were people like Joseph and Catherine Maggio, who ran their corner store on Magnolia Street with pride, greeting customers by name and extending credit to those who needed it. In their neighborhood, like many others, doors were often left unlocked and neighbors looked out for one another. But beneath this picture of civic harmony, darker currents were stirring. The Spanish flu had begun creeping into military camps on the outskirts of town. Whispers of its deadly toll in other cities traveled faster than the disease itself. And in the shadows of New Orleans' gas-lit streets, something else was watching and waiting. Something that would transform this close-knit community into a place of terror and suspicion. No one could have predicted what was coming. Not the police officers walking their beats past the shuttered shops at night. Not the grocers counting their day's earnings before bed. Not even the fortune-tellers in the French Quarter, reading cards by candlelight. The evil that was about to be unleashed would defy explanation and leave a permanent scar on the city's psyche. The weapon of choice was waiting in plain sight. Common axes and chisels, the everyday tools of honest work that would become instruments of horror. The targets were sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware they had been chosen. And the killer, or perhaps something darker than a mere mortal killer, was preparing to make its first move. In the early hours of May 23, 1918, as the last streetcars rattled back to their barns and the city settled into slumber, the creature that would become known as the Axeman selected its first victims. The reign of terror was about to begin, and New Orleans would never be the same. The shadow descends. The morning of May 23, 1918, dawned with a scream that would echo through New Orleans for generations. At 4900 on Magnolia Street, Joseph Maggio's brothers discovered a scene that defied comprehension. But Joseph and his wife Catherine lay in their blood-soaked bed, their throats cut with surgical precision, their faces beaten beyond recognition. The killer had used Joseph's own axe, left behind like a cruel signature. More disturbing still was the message scrawled in chalk outside. Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony. The police were baffled. Not only had the killer managed to enter through a chiseled panel in the door, a hole seemingly too small for any man, but he had committed his savage act while the victim's family slept just next door. No one had heard a sound until it was too late. The Maggios' jewelry and money lay untouched, mocking simple explanations of robbery gone wrong. As May melted into June's suffocating heat, the terror spread. Grocers began sleeping with weapons nearby, checking their doors and windows obsessively. But these precautions proved futile against an enemy who seemed to move like a shadow. On June 28th, Louis Bezumer and his mistress Annie Harriet Lowe joined the growing list of victims, their heads split open as they slept. Annie would linger for 7 agonizing weeks before death finally claimed her, her last words muddled by delirium and a partially paralyzed face. The pattern was emerging, clear as blood on white sheets. The killer had a preference for Italian grocers, yet showed no mercy to those who shared their beds. He used their own tools against them, turning the implements of their honest work into weapons of destruction. Each crime scene told the same story: the chiseled door panel, the bloody axe left behind, the victims discovered in their beds. August brought no relief from either the heat or the horror. The elderly Joseph Romano, an Italian barber, became the next victim. His nieces caught a glimpse of the killer, a dark figure in a suit and slouch hat, disappearing into the night. Their description only deepened the mystery. How could someone so distinctively dressed move through the city unseen? The police increased their patrols. Armed men began taking shifts guarding their sleeping families. Neighbors developed elaborate systems of watchfulness, yet the Axeman, as the papers had dubbed him, continued his reign of terror. Even the most hardened skeptics began to whisper that perhaps they were dealing with something supernatural. How else could the killer slip through locked doors, strike without sound, and vanish without trace? The city's fear took on a desperate edge when the killer demonstrated he could strike anywhere. Mrs. Schneider, 8 months pregnant, survived an attack that left her teeth scattered across her pillow like forgotten pearls. A week later, she delivered a healthy child, but the message was clear. No one was safe, not even the most vulnerable. By the end of summer, New Orleans had transformed. The warm evenings when neighbors would gather on their porches became a distant memory. Streets emptied at sunset. The sound of hammers echoed through neighborhoods as residents reinforced their doors and windows. Grocers began closing early, their owners retreating to armed camps within their own homes. The city's famous hospitality withered in the face of suspicion. Any stranger could be the Axeman. The police found themselves chasing shadows. Every criminal in their files was scrutinized, every similar case from the past examined for connections. They discovered that similar attacks had occurred in 1911, raising the terrifying possibility that the killer had been among them far longer than anyone realized. Each new theory led to a dead end. Each potential suspect proved innocent, and still the attacks continued. In the gathering darkness of these months, a letter was being composed. A message that would push the city's terror to new heights and give the Axeman's reign a soundtrack no one could have predicted. But for now, the citizens of New Orleans could only wait, watching their doors and windows, listening for the sound of splintering wood in the night, and praying they wouldn't be next on the killer's list. The Devil's Jazz. On March 13, 1919, the Times-Picayune received a letter that would transform New Orleans' nightmare into something unprecedented. Written in a clear, steady hand, the missive began with 2 chilling words: "Esteemed mortal." What followed was either the ravings of a madman or something far more sinister, a declaration from a being who claimed to be beyond death itself. "They have never caught me, and they never will," the letter proclaimed. "I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman." The writer spoke of being invisible, a demon from the hottest hell, claiming a relationship with the angel of death himself. But it was his proposition that would etch this moment into the city's history forever. The Axeman declared his love for jazz music, and in what he called his infinite mercy, offered the citizens of New Orleans a deal. At exactly 12:15 a.m. on Tuesday night, he would pass over the city. Any home where a jazz band was playing would be spared. Those who failed to jazz it up, he warned with diabolic glee, would get the axe. The letter spread through New Orleans like wildfire. In cramped newspaper offices and corner bars, over backyard fences and telephone lines, people debated its authenticity. Was this truly their tormentor speaking, or some cruel hoax? More importantly, could they afford to ignore the threat? The city's response was unprecedented. As Tuesday approached, jazz bands became more precious than gold. Every musician in New Orleans found themselves booked for the night. Those who couldn't secure live entertainment scrambled for phonographs. Music stores sold out of jazz records within hours. Even those who had never cared for jazz suddenly developed an appreciation for the genre. A local composer, Joseph de Villa, seized the moment to create the mysterious Axeman's Jazz, its cover depicting terrified families desperately playing music. The song became an instant hit, the soundtrack to a city's collective defiance, or perhaps its surrender to the killer's demands. When the designated night arrived, New Orleans transformed into a vast, frenzied concert. From the grandest hotels to the humblest shotgun houses, jazz poured into the streets. Dance halls and theaters stayed open into the early hours, packed beyond capacity. In private homes, neighbors gathered together, their doors barricaded but their spirits lifted by the music of survival. The scene was surreal. Children fighting sleep on their parents' laps while musicians played until their fingers bled. Elderly couples who had never danced to jazz before now swaying to its rhythms. Priests and prostitutes, dock workers and society matrons, all united in this bizarre ritual of protection. The music ranged from sophisticated orchestras in the French Quarter to amateur attempts on out-of-tune pianos in back parlors. But everywhere, New Orleans was swinging. At precisely 12:15 a.m., the city held its breath, or would have, if not for the thousands of trumpets, pianos, and drums that continued their defiant chorus. In that moment, New Orleans had transformed the Axeman's ultimatum into something unexpected. A celebration of life in the face of death, a communal act of courage disguised as submission. As dawn broke over the city, no new victims had been claimed. The night of jazz had worked, or perhaps the Axeman had simply been satisfied with orchestrating the most unusual concert in New Orleans history. The city had survived, but something fundamental had shifted. The killer had moved beyond mere murder. He had conducted an entire city in a symphony of fear. In the days that followed, many continued to play jazz in their homes, unsure when the Axeman might make his next inspection. Others saw the night as proof that their tormentor was more showman than demon, more human than supernatural. But all agreed that New Orleans would never forget the night when jazz became a matter of life and death. The letter and its aftermath marked a turning point. The Axeman was no longer just a murderer lurking in shadows. He had emerged as something larger, a dark conductor orchestrating a city's fears. But even as New Orleans recovered from its night of forced revelry, no one suspected that the killer's most brutal performances were still to come. When the music stops. The jazz notes had barely faded when the Axeman proved that his musical mercy had been temporary. In August 1919, the sound of music gave way once again to screams. Steve Boca stumbled out of his home on Elysian Fields Avenue, blood streaming from grievous wounds in his skull. He managed to reach a friend's house half a block away, but when questioned later, his memory was as fractured as his skull. The Axeman's trademark remained. The chiseled door, the bloody axe discarded like a performer's prop after the final act. The attack marked a new phase of terror. The killer seemed emboldened by his jazz ultimatum success, striking with increasing frequency and audacity. William Carson, a local druggist, became the first to fight back effectively. When he heard the familiar sound of splintering wood, Carson fired several shots at the intruder. Though the Axeman escaped, he left behind his tools. Not just an axe this time, but also a chisel. The instruments of murder abandoned like offerings at a dark altar. But it was the attack on the Cortimiglia family that showed New Orleans the true depths of horror that awaited them. Rose Cortimiglia woke to find her husband Charles battling with the intruder. The scene that followed would haunt the city's collective memory. Rose, clutching her 2-year-old daughter Mary, begging for mercy as the axe descended again and again. The child's life was not spared. Charles and Rose survived their grievous wounds, but their tragedy sparked a new wave of terror through the city. Not even the youngest and most innocent were safe from the Axeman's rage. The attack's aftermath brought its own kind of horror. Rose, perhaps driven mad by grief and trauma, accused her neighbors, the Giordano family, of the crime. A father and son were sentenced to hang based on her testimony. It was only when Charles, her husband, vehemently denied her claims that the truth emerged. Rose admitted to false accusations born of old jealousies, but the damage was done. The Axemen had not only destroyed a family through murder, but had also poisoned the bonds of trust between neighbors. Sarah Laumann, only 19 years old, became the next victim. She was discovered in her locked and shuttered home, her teeth scattered across her pillow like bloody pearls, her skull battered but miraculously intact. She survived but, like so many others, could remember nothing of the attack. The Axeman had become an artist of amnesia, ensuring his victims could never identify him. The police found themselves drowning in theories and suspects. Every drop tool, every scattered clue seemed to lead nowhere. The killer's method of entry, those impossibly small chiseled panels, continued to defy explanation. Some victims reported seeing a tall, dark figure in a slouch hat. Others remembered nothing at all. The only consistency was inconsistency itself. The Spanish flu's resurgence that fall added another layer of darkness to the city's suffering. Death walked the streets in two forms now, one wielding a microscopic weapon, the other an axe. Neighborhoods that had once vibrated with life fell quiet, their residents huddling behind locked doors, unsure which killer they feared more. Even the city's celebrated jazz clubs felt the change. The music continued, but now it carried undertones of hysteria. Every performance might be the difference between life and death if the Axemen decided to issue another ultimatum. Musicians found themselves playing not just for entertainment, but for survival, their songs becoming prayers against the darkness. The investigation began to splinter under its own weight. Each new attack brought fresh theories, but no conclusions. The police followed leads that vanished like smoke, questioned suspects who proved innocent, and gathered evidence that led to dead ends. The Axemen seemed to delight in their frustration, each failed attempt to catch him adding to his mystique. As autumn deepened, a strange fatalism settled over New Orleans. The city that had once danced to ward off death now seemed resigned to waiting for the next attack. The question was no longer if the Axeman would strike again, but who would be next. In this atmosphere of dread, no one suspected that the killer's final act was about to begin, one that would leave a lasting mystery that would haunt New Orleans for generations to come. The scars remained. On October 27, 1919, the Axeman's brutality reached its horrific conclusion in the Pepitone household. Mike Pepitone's wife was forced to witness the savage mutilation of her husband, his body struck 18 times while their 6 children slept nearby. His blood soaked through the mattress as 2 shadowy figures wielded their weapons with mechanical precision. The scene they left behind, the familiar chiseled door, the discarded axe, the scattered evidence of circus tools, spoke of calculated cruelty rather than supernatural power. The murder stopped, but the suffering didn't end with Pepitone. Their children grew up fatherless. His widow, like so many others, carried the trauma until it twisted into something dark and vengeful. When she shot Joseph Mumphrey in Los Angeles a year later, it revealed how deeply the wounds of that period had cut into the survivors' psyches. New Orleans became obsessed with solving the mystery, but this obsession only amplified the horror. Every Italian grocer wondered if they were next. Every unexplained noise in the night, every shadow glimpsed through a window, every stranger in a slouch hat triggered fresh waves of panic. The police followed endless leads, each dead end adding to the community's frustration and fear. The victims who survived were never the same. Sarah Lauman's lost teeth and fractured memories. The Cortamiglia's dead child and shattered marriage. Mrs. Schneider's miraculous survival and delivery of her baby, forever haunted by what might have been. Steve Boca's scrambled mind, trying to piece together the night that almost killed him. Each survivor carried invisible scars that would never fully heal. The city's fascination with the case bordered on the pathological. Families who had lost loved ones found themselves hounded by the curious and the cruel. The jazz clubs that had once played for survival now commodified the terror, incorporating the Axeman into their mythology. Every new theory, every supposed sighting, every claimed connection to the killer, reopened old wounds for the families who just wanted to forget. When Mumfre's past emerged, his history of targeting Italian immigrants, his suspicious imprisonment and release dates, it offered no real comfort. Whether he was the killer or not, the damage was done. A community that had once left their doors unlocked now lived behind barriers of wood and metal and fear. Neighbors who had once shared meals now shared suspicions. The Axeman had transformed not just the city's nights, but its very soul. Years later, the crime scenes were rebuilt, the blood scrubbed away, the broken doors replaced. But New Orleans never fully recovered its sense of security. The victims' families continued to walk past the sites of their personal tragedies. The grocery store where the Maggios died, the bedroom where little Mary Cortimiglia's life was cut short. Each location marked not just a murder, but the death of the city's innocence. The case remained officially unsolved, but its legacy was written in the changed habits of a population. Doors checked 3 times before bed, children kept close after sunset, suspicious eyes watching every stranger. New Orleans learned that evil needed no supernatural explanation. Human cruelty, wrapped in mystery and fed by fear, could be more terrifying than any demon from hell.